what therapists talk about over coffee? Well, we are three clinical psychologists who like to take a fresh and casual approach to talking about topics that interest us in psychology. Welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock, and thanks for listening. You can find us on our webpage, which is www.offtheclockpsych.com. That's www.offtheclockpsych.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter and on iTunes. Thanks so much for listening. This is our very first episode. We're talking about taking a leap into something meaningful. We're going to be discussing the book Playing Big, Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create, and Lead by Tara Mohr. We're going to talk about our own process of playing big in our own lives. And let me start by introducing our hosts.
Hi, I'm Diana Hill. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in Santa Barbara, California. I completed my doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I primarily practice with individuals and couples using acceptance commitment therapy and other mindfulness-based interventions.
And I'm Debbie Sorensen. I have a Ph.D. from Harvard University, and I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I practice in Denver, Colorado. I work with veterans, mostly practice acceptance and commitment therapy.
And I'm Rae Littlewood. I practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I completed my doctorate at Syracuse University in New York. And I am in private practice working with individuals and couples. And I'm really excited to be here today.
So it's really, I think, fitting that we chose Playing Big by Tara Mohr as our first book to discuss. And I think we envision this as an opportunity to talk about how this book applies to our own lives, but also our private practices, and this real integration between ourselves as psychologists, but also humans that are working to integrate these practices in our own struggles and own lives. And it also fits, I think, for me in terms of the past few years of trying to find more of an integrated place where I'm showing up as vulnerable in my practice and showing up more as me, as a mother and as a clinician. And when Meg McKelvey, who's a good friend and psychologist in Boulder, Colorado, introduced this book to me or suggested it, it was about 6 or 7 months ago, and I was actually really turned off by the idea of a book called Playing Big, because so much of my life has been about not wanting to take on more achievement-oriented things. I've done that, and I know what that feels like. And so I was almost avoidant of taking on a book called Playing Big about women in their careers, thinking that it would be another to-do list. And what I found in reading it and coming together with this book is that it was much more about finding my own voice and how to move out of my safety zones and into areas that I really want to do and love with a sense of kindness towards myself. So I really liked Tara Mohr's quote about what playing big is. And she says, playing big was not about working more, pushing harder, or finding confidence. It comes from listening to the most powerful and secure part of you, not the voice of self-doubt. So I think that that's a good place to sort of start and think about as we take on this podcast as a leap for us as professionals.
And I think that's how we chose this particular book to start with, because I think for each one of us, we came together and all of us have some creative energy around work and wanting to start some new ventures. And we really had a dynamic as a group, and we wanted to do something with that. And for each one of us, doing something like a podcast, kind of putting our voices out there, was, a stretch. And it's something that took a little bit of empowerment to say, okay, we have something to say and we can do this. And so the book was just really fitting as a way for us to practice this by starting a podcast. And also we can connect the material in this book about women speaking up and creating something new, just as part of the process of getting this going. And so I think our plan is we each kind of had a certain part of the book that really resonated with us. And so our plan is to go through a little bit of the book in terms of our own, like what piece really got us, and kind of explore those topics a little bit. So I think, Diana, you were going to start with the chapter that resonated most for you.
Yes, so not surprisingly, well, I don't know, for me, not surprisingly, the chapter that resonated for me was when she talks about the inner critic and really this voice of self-doubt. And she talks about how for women, the voice of self-doubt is a universal experience, which I think is a nice place to start for me, which is this is our common humanity of we all have an inner voice. Even the most successful, put together, on the outside women out there have that inner voice of self-doubt. I think for me as a psychologist, it shows up when I notice I get to see in my practice executives come in or women who look like they have everything together and perfect lives. And then behind closed doors, I get to hear their own self-doubt. And in the same way, for me as a therapist, I may on the outside look like I have something together, but on the inside, I'm questioning myself or wondering if I'm doing a good job, or am I failing my family or failing my clients or not doing enough. So it really resonates for me, the voice of self-doubt and critic. And she talks about in particular some ways in which this voice shows up. So whether it's for women, a voice of body perfection, or if it's harsh, rude, and mean, or a voice that says you're not ready yet, the voice of you're not good at something. And also it takes inspiration from critical people that you've experienced in your life. So maybe there was a critical voice in your childhood that shows up again as an adult and it sounds really familiar. When I recently took a big leap in my practice by doing more trainings for the community and therapists, and I just did a training just a few weekends ago. And I noticed here I am talking about self-compassion and inner critic. And the whole time I have my own inner critic going on, criticizing my discussion of the inner critic. And so it's just so phenomenal how much that inner dialogue is incessant and constant. And it really maps on to this idea of, in acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive diffusion, that we always have thoughts going on, and that really engaging with them or fighting with them sometimes derails us more than just letting them be there and show up. So I practice that in my talk, and sometimes I would even give voice to it. I would even tell the audience, oh my gosh, my inner voice is saying this right now. Sometimes I'll do that in my own practice, just to model and demonstrate that we can have this inner voice, but it doesn't have to run the show. So in taking this leap, I'm sure both of you have had your own inner critics and inner voices that, especially when we take leaps that are important to us, that we really care about, that's when our inner voice, negative voice, or self-doubt gets the loudest. I'm curious for the two of you, have you noticed that in this process of starting a podcast or in other areas of your life recently, the inner critic?
Absolutely. I think, like you said, it runs across all areas of my life as a mom, as a psychologist, as a friend, as a coworker, as a daughter. I mean, it's really, really rampant. And I do resonate with the idea of it being kind of leftovers from childhood, but also leftovers from kind of the choices that I've made going forward. Choosing really achievement-oriented types of endeavors and really getting, I think like Debbie will talk about in a minute, really hooked into this idea that if other people are telling me I'm doing a good job, then I know I'm doing a good job. And when we try to do something like this, where it's just us, right? We're just putting ourselves out there. That's when it really kind of becomes like, wait a minute, you don't really have anything to say. Let's get that book out and read what they said so that, we're sure that we have the right opinion. So this is a huge leap, and it does kind of empower me in multiple areas in my life, both career and personal, to to keep, like you said, like moving in the direction of values, and, you know, just letting that self-doubt sort of live there and not pay too much attention to it.
How about you, Jen?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's I about doing a podcast. I mean, what do I know? That comes up absolutely. I think for me right now, most strongly though, is that I'm going to be doing a workshop in in about a month from now. I'll be doing it actually, and it's like much longer than I normally do. It's a training kind of thing, and I'm starting to work with my co-presenter to get slides ready and to look through the material and prepare. And I just have this sort of assumption in the back of my mind that, you know, well, that it's almost like well, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll fool them, but obviously I don't really know what I'm talking about. And I have to remind myself repeatedly that I do have expertise here. I have something to say. I have experience with this. And just that nagging, I like the term imposter syndrome that's in there somewhere of like, well, maybe this will be the time they really find out that I really don't know what I'm doing. So I'm doing it anyway. And I just keep noticing that little voice popping up. The key is to just kind of know what it is.
Yes, I think that for me, when I listen to that voice, I end up playing small, or I end up being in places that are safe. And yeah, I can excel in a safe place, but is it really where my heart wants to be? After we sort of identify our inner critic as maybe a voice that's going to get in the way of taking these big leaps or playing big, there's the next step or the next piece that she talks about. Do you want to talk a bit about what struck you, Deb?
Okay, so the part that struck me is about, she has a chapter called Unhooking from Praise and Criticism. And basically that we tend to be, women especially, but I think sometimes, you know, men also experience a lot of this as well. I want to acknowledge that. But we have a relationship orientation where we're very attuned to what other people say to us, and whether we get praised or criticized, that can be a very we can have a strong reaction to that. So what a lot of times happens, we get into this sort of good girl mode where we're likable and nice and we don't make any waves, and we might hold ourselves back from our own ambitions because we're trying to avoid getting any sort of negative feedback. And I know for myself, I get really upset when I hit a little bit of criticism. It really stings for me. I know, like, if I'm teaching a class and I get, you know, generally pretty good reviews or teaching evaluations, but then I get one person who just kind of makes a few remarks criticizing me, I really fixate on that. I get kind of upset about it, and I start to feel self-doubt. And I think when you put something out in the when you create something or when you put something out in the public, you will have some criticism. It's just an inevitable part of doing that kind of work. And so a lot of people hold themselves back so as not to have that criticism. And that is certainly something I could relate to. And I really liked, and I don't know, actually, maybe I'll pause right there because she has a little suggestion about what to do about that. But I wanted to just see if that's something you guys could relate to as well. Just that, you know, kind of interplay with praise and criticism and how that impacts your willingness to put yourself out there.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really that shift from private to public. I think in my private life, and even in my professional private life, what gives me the ability to kind of, I don't know, take risks is knowing that I almost always have the opportunity to sort of confront anything that sort of goes wrong, right? Like, I can take responsibility for it. I can work it through with whatever happened. And I'm okay with doing that. But when it comes to shifting to a public audience where people don't know me and I don't know them, I don't have the opportunity to have that kind of sort of feedback, you know, that either in person or just through the comfort of kind of, I don't know, sort of a relationship, you know, that people might cut me some slack because we're friends or because they know me or I know them. And that it's a huge leap for me to say something, to kind of put myself out there as an expert amongst other psychologists, among doctors, in these ways that to play big for me, like that's the next move. So I still don't know how to deal with that. It really does still get in the way of me kind of acting more confident in those contexts. I think I couch a lot of things and I'm careful or, so I'd love to hear.
I can tell you what she has to say. I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to add anything first or...
I think the only thing I want to add is that having children has really shifted this for me, because what it's opened my eyes to is the idea that making mistakes is such an integral part of learning, and that feedback from our mistakes is how we grow. And if we get paralyzed by feedback and paralyzed by mistakes, then we don't grow. And or get into a place of I'm bad because I made a mistake, or I'm learning something. So even in my own children, I see this as they're learning to read or they're learning to write, and that tendency to want to just like back away from things that are difficult for us because we're afraid that it's going to be something that somehow is shameful to struggle. I was going through my kindergarten papers for my son, and he had this really sweet drawing of our family. And it said, I'm grateful for my family at the bottom. And then it had each of us labeled, and it had a picture. It had his brother and me and the dog and dad. And brother was like about the same size. The dog was like the biggest, thing. And mom was floating in the air. And then it was written brother, BRUTHR, brother. And there was something that was so sweet in that mistake. Like in the way that he wrote that, I just loved it. And I think about, oh my gosh, if we were to use our adult mind to look at that and say, oh my gosh, you made a mistake, write it the right way. How much is lost in that vulnerable moment where our struggles show up? So I think of, that's also part of this process is moving towards kindness in our struggles as part of who we are, as opposed to, trying to make everything perfect the first time to avoid criticism.
Which actually, if I might say, reflects this process of us doing this. I mean, we've had some hiccups getting this going, this podcast, and we still feel a little bit of a sense of, well, let's just try it and see what happens. And it feels like a leap, but it also feels a little scary to say, well, we're going to probably make some mistakes and we're going to, learn as we go. That's part of what makes it such a challenge, I think, or makes this book so relevant to this process of us doing this, is that we're learning as we go. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about what Tara Mohr says in the book about how to respond to that, hook of praise and criticism. She really encourages you to take kind of an emotionally neutral stance toward any feedback that you get, any criticism or praise. I think we tend to take it really personally, and it has a big emotional impact. And she really recommends realizing that the feedback doesn't necessarily reflect anything wrong with us, or actually sometimes it's not even really about us as much as it is about the person giving the feedback. So that, I think, by looking at it that way, that allows you to just have a little bit of perspective on it, and to really kind of unhook from the emotional part of it. But instead to take the feedback and basically use it for something useful, which is to ask the question of, how is my message resonating with the people I'm trying to reach? And to recognize that can be important information, but we don't necessarily have to incorporate all of it. And I think one mistake we sometimes make is if somebody criticizes, 4 things about our work, we feel like, oh, well, I have to go back and work on those 4 things and change them and do better next time. But in fact, you don't. You can take that information, take a look at it, see if there's anything helpful about it, and then you can carry on your way. And I think it's nice I feel like it's nice to have permission to do that. Kind of sad that I felt that I needed permission, but in that good girl mode, I think we feel like we have to change all these things or fix them or do them better next time. But actually, no, you don't. You can take that information and do what you want with it. You're in charge of what you do with that information. And to me, that was really empowering to take that stance toward feedback.
Yeah. I also think, there's this idea at times that there's a right way to do things. And I think that comes a lot from our histories and being students for a long time. And when we take on something like this, where there is really no roadmap, right? I mean, there's other people who do podcasts, but for us, what is it that we want to contribute? And that in and of itself is what's really valuable, right? It's like if we were doing it just like, 10 other people, we wouldn't be adding anything. So taking that risk to say, no, it's not the same as what everybody else would do, or it's not written in a book that this is how you do it, but we're coming up with it, and here it is. Take it or leave it, like it or not.
Well, and Rae, I think that kind of is a nice segue into what you were planning to talk about, because it's related to that, right?
Yeah. Let me read just this little section that Tara Mohr kind of sets up this idea that she calls hiding. She says, in this chapter, I'm going to call you out lovingly, call you out. We're going to talk about the ways brilliant women hide from playing bigger, the ways we stall on and talk ourselves out of the very steps that would bring us more fulfillment and enable us to have a more positive impact in the world. All these hiding strategies allow us to avoid playing bigger while convincing ourselves we're moving forward in the most diligent way we can. After all, these are brilliant women's hiding strategies. We are sophisticated in fooling ourselves. This is a huge one for me. And she has a really nice summary of the different ways that we hide. And I'm just going to read a couple of them. So one of them is collecting or curating what everyone else has to say about it, which I just kind of mentioned. This is our graduate school training, right? I mean, how many times have we written review papers where unless someone else has done this and said it's a good idea, we can't move forward, right? It's like the scaffolding idea of ideas in psychology, that you can't just go out there and say, this is the new thing. This is what we're going to do. It's like it has to be built on all of these previous endeavors, which really stops us in our tracks.
Can I jump in with a quick example of that, Rae? And sorry, so I was preparing some slides for a little, talk I was going to give, and I knew exactly what I was going to say, and I have a lot of expertise, so I was writing my slides, but what I found myself doing was trying to find what I was going to say in a book somewhere to make sure it was sort of legitimate. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't feel like I had these sort of authority, even though this is a subject I would say I have some expertise in, but I felt that unless I found it in a book, I didn't have the authority to say it. And really, I had the realization, thanks to having read this book, Playing Big, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. You know what? It's okay for me to just say this because I know what I want to say, and I know I don't need anybody else to be the expert. And so I allowed myself to do it. And I realized the only difference between me and the people who wrote those books I was looking in is that they had put theirs down in a book and I hadn't. So It was very liberating to me to say, I can just say it, actually. I'm enough of an expert myself.
Yeah. Another one that really, I think, happens for me a lot, especially like I was talking about in this shift from private to public, is omitting your own story. And, this really speaks to the fact that, as experts, we're people. We come to relationships with our own histories, and we have this expertise of really understanding our behavior and other people's behavior and the interaction of all of these different factors. But we are so hesitant to give our own context, just really say this happened for me, and a couple of weeks ago, I had this really great opportunity to talk to a group about moving forward with some new ideas and kind of really, following my calling. And I went in, prepared with some slides, and of course I reviewed the literature and, all of these things that we do to sort of over prepare and make sure that we feel comfortable basically saying something like I'm saying right now. And it was my mom who said, well, make sure you talk about your own experience, because that's why you're there, and that's why they're inviting you to be there, is because they know that you have this personal experience that can make you really valuable to other people who are going through this. And it was like, oh my gosh, really? My mother had to tell me this after after all these years. So I appreciated her wisdom on that. And I did. I went in and said, this is my experience. And I think it really did, connect me to the group in a way that was very different than me coming in as the expert psychologist.
I think that's been such a disservice to the field of psychology for so long. And it really has only been more recently where some really prominent researchers like Marsha Linehan, who, established DBT, came out with a New York Times article saying, hey, I was chronically suicidal. And I developed this program to save my own behind. Like I needed to find a way to survive. Steve Hayes, with his background in panic disorder, that really a lot of the really wonderful growths in psychology have come out of the suffering of the psychologists behind them. And yet we're often trained to keep that behind bars, like to hide that, put that in a box, and then come in and just read a bunch of articles about this. But there's a reason why each one of us have come into this field. And I would guess it's from our own experience of suffering and struggle. And there's a reason why we shift in our, maybe in our practices or our focus or our interests over time.
There's something so humanizing about that we're all humans. We all suffer. These kind of things come up for all of us. And the more I think we can speak up about that and acknowledge that, the more we can all be more real with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I wasn't going to specifically lay them out, but there's a really useful chapter, I think, that translates some of the ways that I communicate that undermine me sort of owning my perspective or having something important to say, or even talking about my own experience. And she kind of lays out these several different ways that we kind of couch what we say. And for example, can I just read a couple of these because I just love them? I'm sure you all laugh, either internally or externally. So these are listed under undermining speech habits. I'm really guilty of these ones. They're called qualifying phrases. I'm no expert, but I know you've been all been thinking about this for a longer time than I have. I could be wrong, but... And then this one, does that make sense? And you know how many times I say that just in a day? I can't even count. And the way that she talks about that, which I just think is it was such an insight for me, was that it implies that I'm not making sense, right? That something that I'm saying either isn't correct or, I haven't phrased it right. So instead shifting it to something that's more about the other person, right? Like, how did that land with you? Or, how does that sound to you? Or, something that doesn't sort of put it back on me having to then explain it again if it doesn't make sense, right? So I just really like those. And she gives a lot of really awesome examples just in written communication too, like emails, about how you sort of set things up. So I think this book really, it was so useful to me because it draws together this kind of intersection between my inner world and what I'm expressing, and really helps me to look at kind of that translation of what's going on for me internally that I really want to put out there in the world, and how do I do that in a way that supports me to not buy into the self-doubt, to not make myself sound less than I am, and to really just go for it in a sort of cliche way, which was just undermining my own statement that I said there.
At least you were aware.
I'm glad you said all those statements at the end of our conversation, Rae, because if we said them at the beginning, then we'd be so hyper-focused on every time we said just, or does that make sense, or I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm a big apologizer. Like, I just apologize for existing on this planet. It's yeah.
To me, there's a fine line between disqualifying yourself and, that, oh, well, I don't really know, but, or, saying those kinds of disqualifying types of statements, and actually being authentic in that way, to acknowledge the self-doubt and to kind of be real about that. Because I think sometimes people err on the other side, where it's like they just have this sort of false bravado. And I really think there's a middle ground there, that if we're aware of the times that we cut ourselves down or disqualify ourselves before we even start talking, that's really helpful. But there still has to be some room for people to acknowledge some of the vulnerability as well. I don't think it's all about just trying to adjust to this man's world and just be super confident all the time. I don't think that's the solution, but I also think that it's really good to be aware of that tendency that especially women have to always apologize for speaking up, or to always cast doubt about themselves knowing what they're talking about.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that you said in a previous conversation, Diana, about warmth and friendliness and expertise. And what was it? Do you remember?
Oh, that when you are in a professional setting and people are making a judgment about you, about your how qualified you are for something, that judgment comes from a combination of warmth and expertise, and that the credibility. Thank you, credibility. Yeah. And the warmth is actually the first thing that people make the judgment about. It's the first judgment is made around warmth, and then credibility comes next to back that up. And that it's really easy to lose credibility. You just have to do one small thing wrong to lose someone's, for people not to think that you're qualified based on your credibility, but warmth sticks around for a long time. And so I think that that's actually a strength that we have as I think, and if the women tend to be more relationally focused, to bring the warmth first and bring the authentic self first, that we don't have to go in with, the credibility factor. And that actually forming that relationship is important. Like you were saying, Debbie, it's not just about being a man, acting like a man in a man's world, but it's bringing the feminine qualities in without disqualifying ourselves. Yeah. So at the end of the book, she does this afterward where she reveals that she wrote this book while she was pregnant with her first child, and that she's actually looking, at her life with maybe the possibility of a different perspective now, having a child. And I was interested because she was writing this afterward with only a 3-month-old. And the way that she seems to present it was a bit of, does everything change because I've had a child? And she says no. And, I still can work and I can still do all these things. And that maybe there's this false belief out there that is undermining women that doing it all is not possible. And I actually was curious about what your reactions were as working moms and moms with young kids to her commentary in the afterword, and if it fit for you or if there was pieces that didn't fit.
Well, for me, this is just always I don't know if I want to say struggle. I feel so fortunate, and I think there are so many women who just aren't able to have the luxury of of being in this situation, but that I obviously really value being a parent, and I love being with my kids, and I value my work, and I love my work, and I feel like I have something important to contribute there. And I feel lucky because I found a pretty workable balance for me. And I still make decisions every single day about, do I put the kids in front of a cartoon so I can sneak off and get an hour of work done? Do I sign up to do this extra thing? Right now I had to kind of go hide in the basement to record a podcast and keep my kids quiet and, ship them off. And, and it's a Saturday morning, and it's very, it's a decision that I feel like I make every single day, and there's no easy. I feel guilty sometimes either way. I feel guilty when I'm not keeping up with work, and I feel guilty when I'm not, right there present with my kids. And, again, I think I probably have about as good of a situation for myself as I could imagine. And yet every single day I struggle with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I kind of got the sense in that afterward of sort of to be continued. Mm-hmm. She's at the beginning of this, and I don't know that her sort of, I think, initial hypothesis is like, I'm not going to be a completely different person just because I have a kid. But I think, it is transformative, and it's not an immediate thing. It's a very gradual process, and there's decisions every day about what's important to you and what are you going to choose. And that's really what it comes down to, is that every day it's a choice. And we're talking a lot about this in the context of choosing between, sort of professional and personal goals and what that looks like. But I think it's just as relevant, for somebody who's choosing to, to stay at home with their kids, that there's still this inner yearning to be big, to do stuff that's really meaningful and kind of outside of the typical mundane stuff. And we can kind of get lost in that, in the routine, and not know, God, what is this discomfort? What is this restless feeling? Is it me not being happy with my situation, or is it just like, I just need a little bit more? I don't know. And so I think it's a to be continued. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, playing big can mean so many different things. It can mean, and I was thinking about, Rae, when we were at the Kelly Wilson training, for me, playing big in relationship to my children was getting myself to a yoga class or doing some kind of self-care with my children, finding that part of myself as this also needs to be fed and watered. And I think that's where it can be. There's playing big in the context of, okay, I'm going to take on this big talk, or I'm going to launch, start writing a book, but that playing big can also be, I'm going to check out African drumming, because that's something that I've always wanted to do. Or with my son, I was such a safety addict when I was a girl. I never learned how to do a cartwheel because I didn't want to fall. And I've been practicing cartwheels again with my son, and having him videotape me doing a cartwheel. And then I videotape him, and we look at, okay, this is what I want to try and do differently the next time. I mean, that for me, it actually is really playing big, because I have that is not an area that I feel I ever conquered. Yeah.
Yeah. That takes courage right there.
Yeah. Try it.
Well, and for me, I have two daughters, and I think this would be true for, you both have sons, and I'm sure this is true for you too, but I think with daughters, I'm very much aware of wanting to role model to them that my work is important too, that, I love being a mom and I love being with them, and my work matters and it's important. And I want to role model to them that it's not just something I do that takes me away from the home, that is, something I'm just doing for money or whatever. It's an important contribution that I'm making, and it's something that I achieved, and I want them to know that. And so to me, even when I am sometimes focusing a little bit more on work, I try to find the value in that in terms of my parenting, like the two sort of come together. Because I'll say sometimes something to them like, oh, I had a really big day at work today, or I have something really important I have to go do later, because I want to send them that message that it's okay for me to work, and it's an important thing.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
So as we close, it seems like just kind of reviewing that part of playing big is noticing that self-doubt that shows up when you move towards your inner calling and that critic, and unhooking from praise and criticism as being the delineators of what you do in your life, that those, really listening more to your own inner wisdom and inner voice. And then this last piece of looking at ways in which we hide and undermine ourselves. And I also want to just sort of pose a question to each of you, which we didn't talk about ahead of time, which is what's one way you intend to play big, maybe this week or between now and we talk again, or is there something you want to play big at?
Well, for me, I had mentioned earlier this workshop that I'm doing in a month. I mean, just owning that, like finding my voice in that, stepping out of my comfort zone. I mean, it's a 4-day workshop and I'm co-presenting, but I mean, I really am going to have to step up to the plate to do this. And I'm going to have to muster some courage because it's scary.
Wow. You go, girl.
Thank you. I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it's just a continuation of what I guess this week I've been playing big a little bit. And it's just looking for opportunities to connect to new people, really. Feeling like my network is a little narrow right now, and just in-person network. And so, I don't know, I feel like I'm doing the things that sort of I would like other people to do, so sort of when you have a casual meeting with somebody at a park and you're like, oh, it was really good to know you. And then it just, what usually happens is that it just sort of ends there, and being like, hey, here's my number. Like, let's meet up at the park again sometime. So that feels like a big risk to me, to sort of be the one to do that. And I've done it twice this past week. So
good for you. How about you, Diana?
One thing that's just coming up for me that it feels like in this physical world of my limitations in the physical world that my son and I have been working on, that I want to keep on working on and playing big, is engaging in more outdoor physical play. So whether that's when he climbs a tree, climb it. When he jumps off of something, a big rock, practice jumping off of it, and play big in play. That's what I want to do more of. Yeah.
More cartwheels.
More cartwheels.
Are you going to show us those videos?
Maybe just you. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, it's wonderful to talk with you ladies. Yeah. I look forward to our next conversation, and it's been great.
Thanks again for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. We'd really love it if you'd write a review for us on iTunes. And you can also find resources and other podcasts that we've recorded on our webpage, which is www.offtheclockpsych.com. That's www.offtheclockpsych.com. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and iTunes. Thanks for listening.